Welcome back. So with this image as our starting point, again, we have our background scene, we have our apple layer, we have our curves adjustment layer to make it look a little bit more like it's involved in the scene or could have been photographed in the scene. We have that as our starting point. Now what we want to do is add elements that actually will make it look like it might be part of the scene. Some cues that you would take are the shadows, from the original elements here. So we have a shadow on this side of the tree, shadow on this side of the shed, the length of the shadows, and so the length of the shadows will help when we're trying to create our own type of shadow or our own fake, fakeisms. And so if you retrace the tip of the shadow to what's casting the shadow, you will find the actual kind of location of the light source. So in this case, if I drew an imaginary line here, from here up here, we know that the light source is up this way. Okay, so almost like a 45-degree angle, pretty much. So our shadow being cast here would also be at a 45-degree angle. So we can see that would actually end up off screen. And so that's fine. That's exactly what we want to do, is have a long shadow, because these are long shadows. So we're just trying to mimic the environment that we're working in. So how do we do that? So the first thing I need to do is make a new layer. So layer, new layer, and we'll call it shadow. Cool. Now, usually shadows represent or resemble the objects that cast them. In this case, since the apple is kind of round, we can keep it super simple and use a shadow that actually is kind of a stretched out round shape. If you think of this tree as being kind of skewed down here, sorry you can't see that, this tree here is skewed down, that's what the shadow represents. So let's use the elliptical marquee tool. And so you never thought that you actually need that tool, did you? So here what I want to do is I'm just going to do it around here. We're going to stretch it out, but let's just say that's probably good. Now again, look how skinny these shadows are over here. It's because the angle that they're cast at aren't very wide, so we're going to have skinny shadow, relatively skinny shadow over here as well. So here's my approach to making shadows more realistic in Photoshop. You're not going to fill it with black paint and just change the opacity, because then it's going to look like black paint changed the opacity. What I want to do though is I want to go ahead and use a dark value or color from where the shadow is going to sit on. So I'm going to pick a color in here. And so I'm going to use the eyedropper tool. And I can sample, and hopefully you can see that. Let me move this over here. You can see the little crosshairs. I'm going to click on this area here. Now, it's going to change the foreground color. To click on a different area, so you can see it. So whatever I click on, notice the foreground color is changing. That's what we're end up doing, is we're going to pick a color or value from the area that the shadow is going to sit on. So here I'm going to click this. Let me zoom back out so we can see our shape here. And I'm going to do an edit fill. Now before I do that, I want to make sure that we're not filling with black, we're filling with a foreground color. Normal 100%, no preserved transparency because the layer is already transparent. And the key thing is that you want to make sure that you're on a layer that doesn't have any image on it already. So you don't want to do this to another layer. Like if we were on the apple layer by accident, it would actually make a solid fill here on the apple. So double check, make sure you're on the correct layer. Click OK and select deselect. Looks realistic, huh? I know. So here, move tool. I'm going to move that down because that's where it's supposed to be. Now, one of the things that you learned with doing the colorize assignment was that we have blending modes. The one that works well for this is the multiply. You can already see by changing it from normal to multiply, it's darkening that area. You can even see the apple through it. Now we don't want to see the apple through it, so we're going to drag this shadow down below the apple layer, and now it sits behind. Again, you want to take visual cues from the actual image, so this is way too hard. You know, it's super crisp edges, especially if it's going on this grassy field. So we definitely want to make that softer. So what we want to do is I'm going to go under Filter, Blur, and do a Gaussian Blur. You're going to have to give it your best guess. I think 10 would be way too high. Maybe 3 or 4. And it all depends on what the surface is. You know, if it's a really hard surface, then you'll, not like grass like this, then you'll probably have a more defined shadow. You know, if it's an overcast day, you'll have a soft shadow. If it's a sunny day, you'll have a hard shadow. So we want to mimic the scene that we're in. So I'm going to click OK on this. That looks pretty good. Now, obviously, it's too dark. Even though the other shadows are dark, they're so far away, we really can't tell how dense they are. But up close, you can. So I definitely want to lower the opacity on this so we can see through it. Now it's starting to look, even though it's kind of, oval shaped, it's starting to look a little bit more realistic. Okay, so here, again, lowering the opacity, we can always change it later if we need to. So what I want to do is I'm going to reposition this with the Move tool. Again, remember our shadow is kind of at a 45-degree angle. So here, if we drew a 45-degree angle here, it's going to be a little bit to the left there. Now here, that 45-degree went off the screen. We're not quite off the screen yet, so let's actually make this go off the screen. Edit, Edit, Free Transform, and you can move and stretch this box. So I'm going to drag this out. Okay. And it's scaling it up too, but we can push it back a little bit. So you can move this around. And just so you can, some of the things you can do with the Free Transform tool while you're here, you can scale it up and down. Notice how the outside the box, you get the little curve shape. I can rotate it as need be. And again, I can stretch it up and down. If you want it to be a non-uniform, you just uncheck this box here and you can, change the width and height separately. Okay. And all I did here was I just dragged left or right on the W, and it actually will let you slide, the scale, which is pretty cool. All right, so we have that and that. So again, we're kind of like mimicking that 45-degree angle. That's probably close. We'll go a little wider. Cool. And let's see. Yeah, I think. Yeah, good. I think that's fine. I can move it over a little bit more. Awesome. Again, we're trying to mimic that angle here. So there to about there looks believable. Click check mark up here or double click inside, and now we can see we have a shadow that's cast along the ground. And again, you can lower or increase the opacity as need be, and really dial it in. Okay, now, when you look at any everyday object, and let's look at this apple real quick. So I'm going to actually turn this on, turn the mask off so you can actually see what the shadow looked like originally. Notice on this, we have a shadow from the original photograph here, and it's light shadow. But directly below the object, the apple, where the apple touches the surface, it's going to be darker. So as you get farther away from the object, the shadow is going to be lighter. But right underneath it, it's going to be the darkest. So we need to mimic that as well in this sample. So we're going to do this pretty much the same thing by creating another shadow layer, a different one, so we have control over it. And then we're putting it directly below to kind of make it look like it's anchored to the ground. And that's the key, is having shadows will help anchor your object. If you didn't, no shadow here, it looks totally pasted in there because there's no visual cues to say, hey, that apple is actually in that field. Here, like, wow, how'd that apple get in that field? And so with a shadow, it will anchor it. Now we want to make it really realistic, or even more realistic, by adding another layer underneath here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the new layer icon. We'll call this one Shadow 2. Very creative naming process. And so now you can go in and make another elliptical selection, fill it and all that stuff. Or sometimes you can kind of keep it simple, use your paintbrush, okay, and we're using that same dark color. That didn't change. If it did, just resample with the eyedropper. You know, pick a new color or value. Pick it over here. And then use your paintbrush. Again, with a larger paintbrush. And because it's a shadow, we want it to be a soft paintbrush. So the hardness we're taking down to 0. And again, I'm using the bracket keys to make the brush bigger or smaller. That's probably a good size. And so what I'm going to do, again, is make sure I'm on my correct layer. I'm going to go ahead and paint. Now you always see is this kind of ugly brown right now. So I'm going to change the blending mode. So remember, on a shadow layer, you need to change the blending mode. Now obviously that's too dense. So let me back up a couple steps here because there's something I wanted to do prior to that. Okay, good. So instead of painting and then changing the blending mode, I'm going to go ahead and change the blending mode of this layer first to multiply because I know it's going to be multiply anyway. We have our brush, we have the hardness set to 0. Now the one thing I forgot to change was the flow. We want to lower the flow so it builds slowly and not so quickly. So here I'm going to go ahead and paint. You can kind of see it's building, and I can let go and let it get denser and paint over top of it. Now again, we have the blending mode set to multiply of the layer, not the paintbrush. The paintbrush is always normal. But again, we want the shadow to be directly below the object. And you know, right now, obviously it's a little on the dense side. So I can lower the opacity on this, on the layer, to really dial it in. Okay, so here we have our secondary shadow and our primary shadow. The secondary shadow is super subtle, but it's just giving us another level of kind of density on this. One thing that's kind of bugging me is this little edge right here. So what I want to do is I can mask it out, but since this is such a kind of an organic thing, I'll use the eraser. It'll be a little cheaty. You know, you can go back in and recreate this shadow very easily, but I want to get rid of that, just kind of that funky edge right there. Okay, so if we look at the history, all I did was see what that looks like. This is the after, before, and after. So all I did was just kind of, it just looked too uniform. So I want to get rid of that a little bit. Okay, now what we need to do is, we've got it pretty tight, but again, looking at the apple here, and it's kind of hard to tell on this, but the bottom underneath here is a little darker than the top up here. So we need to kind of mimic that same idea. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. I'm going to click on top though, because if you create the layer below it, we wouldn't see anything. So I'm going to go layer, new layer. See, I'm doing different approaches to this. So that way you can see that there's multiple ways to do the exact same thing. I'm going to click OK. No clipping mask yet. Now I want to create a shadow here for the apple. So just like we did with the ground, I want to sample a color or value that might make sense on the apple. Now this might be too dark and too green, so I'm going to go ahead and sample the existing shadow on the apple itself. I'm going to click right there. That's probably good. We can always darken it. Actually, you know what? Click on this. Yeah, that's probably good. Or even the bottom. How's that? Make up your mind. Okay, so here I'm going to take my paintbrush. Again, using a nice soft brush. And I'm going to go ahead and make a bigger brush. And all I want to do is paint a shadow here. So if you look at the object here, the tree and the shed, the shadow is on the right hand side. So we're going to have a shadow that's going to wrap around here. Okay, it might be a little darker on the bottom and kind of trail off up here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and paint. And don't worry, if you see paint, I'll fix it, I promise. All right, let's make it a little darker here. I might have to change the color a little bit. It might be a little on the light side. So, because I painted on a layer that had no mask or anything, it painted everywhere. It was basically a lot of overspray, as you can see. Now, this is where our clipping masking really comes in handy. If you had a mask on the apple and you applied a similar mask to the shadow, if you change the apple mask down the line, you're going to have to change the apple shadow mask as well. But using a clipping mask, if I change the apple mask, it changes the way the apple shadow appears. So, again, it's okay if you already have a clipping mask going on. Click on the layer that you want to mask. Make sure it's above a layer that you want to use as a mask, or that's part of a clipping mask, as this is. Go Layer, Create Clipping Mask, and bam. It shows up as with the little arrow pointing down to the bottommost layer. So looking at the apple, if I go in, I'll just show you a little demo here. If I go to the apple and I mask it, notice the shadow goes away as well because I masked the apple and the shadow relies on the apple layer mask. So, super handy. Now, even though that's a darker color for the apple shadow, it still needs to be set to multiply because we want to darken it but seem realistic. So without it and with it, so again, let's go over here. Whoa, that was a hard edge paintbrush set to 100%. So again, I want to lower the flow with my paintbrush. I'm going to change the hardness to 0, and that's probably good. I'm going to make the brush a little smaller, and so I'm going to go ahead and paint along here. Okay. Make the brush a little soft, and so you can kind of get in there and fine tune it. All right, so on this one, I think the shadow is a little too orange. So what I want to do is I'm going to darken it a little bit. So what I can do is actually run a curves adjustment or some kind of adjustment directly on it. So let's go Image, Adjustments. Let's do Hue Saturation. That'll change the color. I can change the brightness at the same time. And so here, if I wanted to change the hue, make a green apple. But here I'm going to go ahead and make it a little, that's probably a little bit better. Maybe lower the saturation and then lower the lightness. Now again, I have my layers still set to 100%, so I can fix that and lower that after the fact. So that's probably a little bit better. And then I'm going to lower the opacity here to make it a little bit more realistic. So without it, too bright. Here I can go back in and paint along the edge here and so on. If you need to, if you put too much on there, again, you can use the eraser tool or you can add a layer mask to this. So even on the apple shadow, if I click on the layer mask, just to give myself a super amount of control, I'm going to go ahead and use black paint here. And all I did was took a little bit off. Yep, took so much off I can't even see it. Oh, because I was on the eraser tool. Ha. See? Even after all this time, you can still be in the wrong spot. So again, with the paintbrush, I'm on the layer. Notice there's my little mask that I just created before and after. So you can go in and really, fine tune the shape as need be. So the idea here is that we're going to create this curve so that it makes it a little bit more integrated, makes it a little bit more believable, and maybe a little bit up here on that side. Cool. All right, nice. So one last thing we're going to do, and then we'll be done with this video, is we created a shadow side. Now, maybe just in case, now this looks actually probably pretty good, but what if you needed a highlight as well? Well, we can do the same thing. And so, again, creating a new layer, new layer, call it highlight. And from there, I'm going to go ahead and sample a lighter color. So again, using the eyedropper tool, sample a lighter like the yellow from the apple here, paintbrush, and let's say we want to add a little bit of highlight here. It's a little bit on the brighter side. You're not really seeing any change yet. Now this color works for the apple. It won't work for the leaf because it's green. If we needed to change that, we could. But just like with the shadows, we had a blending mode set to multiply. For highlights, we want a blending mode set to screen, or you can try overlay, but screen usually is the one that works the best. Without it and with it, now you can see it's a little on the bright side, but if you needed to create a kind of a more highlight situation. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and paint over this area. Okay. Now, I think we had that video prior to this one where we don't want it to be on the leaf here. So we do want to create a mask for this. So easiest way to do that is to turn this off, get our quick selection tool. I'm going to pick the leaf, pick this stem, and all I'm doing is adding to that selection. Okay, now, because I have more selected than I need, I'm going to subtract. Notice the little minus sign up top here. And I'm just going to click in because, see, if you go too far, I'm going to click back to add. Cool. I want to add this back in. And this is getting me closer. Make the brush a little bit smaller, again with the bracket keys and minus. It's hard to see that little minus sign. Sometimes you just have to kind of whittle away at it. And if it takes too much off, then you just add it back in like this. And kind of the smaller the brush, the smaller the area it kind of looks at. All right, that's pretty good. It's probably close. So here, what I want to do is this part is selected, and I want to add a layer mask to the highlight. Here's the thing, like we did earlier when we held down the Option or Alt key with the mask, it'll make a mask of the opposite of what you have selected. So here, I don't want to see this. I want this to be masked out. So I'm going to hold down the Option key or the Alt key on the PC, click on the layer mask, and bam, it's masked out. So now that highlight goes around the stem and the leaf. Again, lowering the opacity on that layer will help fine-tune it and give us a little bit more realistic result. And again, if you have too much over, like say on this side, turn layers on and off so you can actually see what they're doing. If I have too much over here, I'm just going to click on the mask, take my paintbrush with black or white paint, depending on what I'm trying to do, low flow airbrush, and just kind of remove some of that area. Okay, cool. So I'm glad this was a two-part video. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of time to explain the techniques as well as some of the tools associated with it. What I'm going to do is we'll call this a quits on this video. Make sure we file and save it. Save, keep saving. And this is the approach. So we've got a multitude of techniques and approaches. I'll throw in some other videos that just isolate different techniques for just pieces. So you can push things around and manipulate them and correct perspective and whatnot. On just simple little individual images, and that way they're kind of more reference. Okay, so but for your assignment, this is what you're going to be doing, something like this. Take a look at the criteria for the assignments because you're going to use more than 2 images, but I want you to put it together to make it look as believable as possible and be creative and have fun with it. Okay, talk to you soon.